for coming and listening to my presentation today. I'm really excited to share some of the research I've been working on over the last 2 years. So the title of my presentation is Quantifying the Carbon Sequestered in Saskatchewan Agricultural Soils. I'll just take a moment to thank some of the stakeholders in Dr. Smyth's research chair. These organizations make the research that we do possible, so a huge thank you to all of your contributions. And while I'm thanking people, I'll also thank the farmers who took the time to complete the survey this past fall and winter and spring. I know the survey was fairly detailed and complex, and I know it took a lot of time. So thank you for the time and the data that you contributed to our project. So the focus of my presentation is that Saskatchewan grain producers annually store soil organic carbon in their soils. But the challenge is that farmers are not currently recognized for their carbon storage practices. As a bit of an introduction, the Canadian ag sector emits about 10% of Canada's total national greenhouse gas emissions. And of these total emissions, carbon dioxide represents about 80%, so a fairly significant portion of Canada's emissions. So in recent decades, farmers have adopted more environmentally friendly practices, and these include the adoptions of no-till and minimum till, in place of more traditional practices such as conventional tillage and summerfallow. There's many factors that helped farmers to make these adoptions. So improvements in chemical technologies, fertilizers, improvements in machinery efficiency and more powerful machinery, but also the introduction of herbicide-tolerant crops, and in Saskatchewan, especially herbicide-tolerant canola, played an important role by providing farmers with more effective and more efficient in-crop weed control. So soil organic carbon is the carbon that is stored in our soil organic matter. And soil organic carbon levels change when there's a change in the balance between the carbon that is input to the soil from crop residues and the carbon that is lost from soil emissions. When farmers adopt sustainable land management practices, they help to increase soil organic carbon levels by reducing soil disturbance and increasing crop residue levels. Consider that all soil organic carbon was once carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So when we increase soil organic carbon levels, we actually help to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide, and this is how we contribute to reduced net greenhouse gas emissions. Why is all of this science important? So policies increasingly focus on environmental sustainability. Current policy discussions such as the federal carbon offset program and the proposed increase to the federal carbon tax not only have environmental impacts, but they also impact farmers economically. Farmers' contributions towards improved environmental sustainability and especially improved sequestration in their soils are often minimized. But we need quantified information on the environmental impacts of farmers' land management practices in order to contribute in a meaningful way to these policy discussions. This led to the development of my main thesis research question. How has carbon sequestration in Saskatchewan agricultural soils changed, resulting from farmers' adoptions of no-till, minimum till, and the virtual elimination of summerfallow since herbicide-tolerant canola was introduced in 1995? So the data for my study was collected through the Saskatchewan Crop Rotation Survey. We asked farmers about their land management practices between 1991 to 1994 and 2016 to 2019, and this provided this 25-year time period. When I conducted my analysis, I used a carbon accounting framework, and I adapted this from the Prairie Crop Energy Model. So in my analysis, I looked at the cropping activities that farmers were using. So this was their tillage and summerfallow activities. I also used a set of carbon coefficients, which estimate how much carbon is input to the soil based on land management practices. Sorry, my screen just changed. I used crop residue levels, which is calculated using the crop yield and the harvest index, the rate of carbon input to the soil, as well as post-harvest crop residue removal techniques. So this was essentially whether farmers removed residues from their fields or left them there. And I aggregated my responses to the semi-arid and the subhumid prairies just based on the climatic differences between these two regions. So by the end of January, I had 100 Saskatchewan farmers complete the survey in its entirety. 99 of these participants completed questions regarding 2016 to 2019, and 52 completed questions from the early 90s period. Overall, when I compared my sample demographics to the Saskatchewan census data from 2016, my sample was slightly younger, had achieved higher education, and operated larger farms than the average Saskatchewan farmer. And as you can see in my figure, the farmers were actually fairly spread across the province, and this provided a great representation of all the regions across the province, which was excellent. So this leads me to my results. How has carbon sequestration in agricultural soils changed since 1995? Okay, slide 12 now. So the first thing we look at is the changes in land management practices. So between these 25 years, hectares without summerfallow in their crop rotation, so hectares that had summerfallow completely removed, increased from 54 to 99% of hectares in our sample, which means that by 2016 to 2019, only 1% of hectares were still managed with summerfallow. Conventional tillage decreased from 55 to only 3% of hectares, while minimum till management increased from 32 to 37%, and no-till increased from 13 to 60% of hectares. So just in this 25-year time period, we saw some huge changes in farmers' management practices. So the next thing we asked farmers about was how various technologies help them to make these adoptions on their farms. So the technologies that we focused on were herbicide-tolerant canola, glyphosate, as well as other herbicide-tolerant crops. So farmers assigned these technologies a value from 1 to 10 based on how beneficial they were to their reductions in tillage and summerfallow practices. So on average, herbicide-tolerant canola received an attribution factor of 7.3 out of 10, and glyphosate received a factor of 9.1 out of 10. So respondents showed that these two technologies were very important in their adoptions of reduced tillage and reduced summerfallow. Other herbicide-tolerant crops were not as effective for farmers. They received an average value of 5.3. This is not surprising. In Saskatchewan, canola is planted on far greater acreage than, for example, soybeans or corn, and especially in the early 90s period. And the second question we asked was what percentage of their land would include summerfallow management without herbicide-tolerant cropping systems. So the average response here was 24%. And this may not seem like a huge number, but when we consider that 1% of land in our sample is currently managed with summerfallow, this actually represents a huge step backwards in farmer sustainability efforts. So after these two analyses, we can look at the net change in soil organic carbon. And this is discussed in terms of tons of carbon per hectare per year. So when looking at the effects from changes in tillage practices, the way I calculated these numbers was by taking the carbon sequestered from no-till and minimum till practices during this time period, and then subtracting the carbon that was emitted from farmers' conventional till practices. And then I took the total balance of carbon and divided it by the total number of hectares in the sample so that everything can be discussed on a per hectare basis. So in the early 90s, farmers were still frequently tilling their soil, and this resulted in the average hectare of crop production actually being a net source, so emitting about 0.03 tons of carbon per year. But as farmers adopted these conservation tillage practices on a wide scale, the average hectare of crop production became a net sink, so it was sequestering about 0.12 tons of carbon per year. Similarly, the effects from the changes in summerfallow practices are calculated by taking the sequestration from the hectares where summerfallow had been removed, and then subtracting the emissions from summerfallow practices that were occurring. So in the early 90s, farmers were just beginning to reduce summerfallow from their crop rotations, and the average hectare was storing about 0.02 tons of carbon per year. But by 2016 to 2019, farmers had almost completely eliminated these practices, resulting in the average hectare being a net sink of about 0.42 tons of carbon per year. Now we'll go to slide 15. So we can take these net change in soil organic carbon values and apply them to various sizes of land to better illustrate these results. So if we consider a 1,000 hectare farm, typical in Saskatchewan, in the early 90s, this farm was actually emitting about 26.5 tons of carbon per year from their tillage practices. By 2016 to 2019, however, this farm was sequestering 122 tons per year as they adopted conservation tillage. In the early 90s, this farm was also sequestering about 21.6 tons of carbon per year as they began to reduce their summerfallow practices. But by 2016 to 2019, this had increased to 420 tons per year from this farm as they eliminated summerfallow completely. We can also apply these values to the total Saskatchewan crop production area, which is about 15 million hectares. And again, this is just extrapolating the results from my subset of farmers. So in the early 90s, from farmers' tillage practices, Saskatchewan soils were emitting just over 400,000 tons of carbon per year. But as Saskatchewan farmers adopted conservation tillage, the Saskatchewan soils began to sequester 1.86 million tons of carbon every year. And as farmers went from small reductions in summerfallow practices to almost completely eliminating these practices, annual sequestration from Saskatchewan soils increased from just over 300,000 tons to about 6.38 million tons every year. So we can also discuss these results in terms of vehicle emission equivalents. So consider that the average Canadian car burns about 2,000 liters of gasoline every year. And this results in that car emitting about 1.25 tons of carbon every year. So if we consider again this hypothetical 1,000 hectare farm, in the early 90s, tillage practices on this farm resulted in emissions that were equivalent to the emissions from about 21 cars. But by 2016 to 2019, this farm's adoption of conservation tillage practices resulted in sequestration from these soils, which was equivalent to actually taking about 98 cars off the road. Similarly, as farmers began to increase their reductions in summerfallow, basically eliminating these practices, their emissions went from the equivalent to their sequestration went from the equivalent to 17 cars in the early 90s to 336 cars by 2016 to 2019. And remember, this is just from this 1,000 hectare farm. So the final analysis was trying to place an economic value on these gains in soil organic carbon. So I used 3 different pricing scenarios to place this value on the increase. So the first was a carbon removal marketplace, and I modeled this after the Nori online carbon removal marketplace, which is based out of Seattle. The second pricing scenario was the 2019 federal carbon tax value. And the third was Canada's estimate of the social cost of carbon. And this represents the monetary damage which would result from 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide being emitted in a year. So again, if we consider this 1,000 hectare farm, The increase in annual carbon sequestration that occurred from tillage practices over the past 25 years can be valued from between $11,000 to $25,000 based on the difference in these pricing scenarios. Similarly, the increase in annual carbon sequestration resulting from farmers' widespread reductions in summerfallow practices over the 25-year period can be valued from between $30,000 to $70,000 from this 1,000 hectare farm. So I just threw a bunch of numbers at you, but what do these mean for us as farmers and as industry members? Well, we know that conversations about carbon sequestration and recognition for the sequestration in policy discussions requires quantified data. Currently, the way the federal offset program is designed is that it won't recognize sequestration that occurred prior to 2017. But as my results showed, by 2016 to 2019, farmers had almost completely eliminated conventional tillage and summerfallow practices from their operations, which means the way the program is designed, farmers don't really have the opportunity to be recognized for these sustainable adoptions. The results of my study have already been shared with the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture, and they did help to expand farm exemptions for the carbon tax. And this just shows that these results and these discussions are relevant for current policy deliberations, and also they're required by policymakers when making these policy decisions. As farmers and as an industry, we need to do a better job of informing the government and the public of the impacts of farmers' land management changes. And this will also help to protect farmers' use of current and future beneficial technologies. So as my results showed, technologies such as herbicide-tolerant crops and complementary chemicals like glyphosate have helped farmers to make these adoptions. However, in the media and in the public, these technologies often are discussed very negatively. So it's important that the benefits, not only for farmers, but also for the environment, are discussed openly with the public. So where do we go from here? Well, the first thing is that we have to expand the research to include the full emission cycle. So in my thesis research, all I looked at was carbon sequestration, but also looking at the positive emissions is very important to be able to gauge how the whole emission cycle has changed in this time period. We also need to look at changes in chemical and fertilizer use as well, because we know that the use of these inputs has changed dramatically over the recent decades as well. And we need to try to gauge these environmental impacts. We will be expanding the crop rotation survey into Manitoba and Alberta this year to help capture the effects across the prairies, so not only limited to Saskatchewan. And finally, we plan to collect this data every 5 years, and this will help to create an ongoing database of this ag sustainability movement. And for any farmers who completed this survey, they know that looking back 25 years ago to provide data can be a little bit difficult. So consistently collecting this data will eliminate the need to look back quite so far in the future. So some key takeaways I want you to remember from this presentation. Number one, Saskatchewan crop farmers have increased their annual sequestration rates by between 0.15 and 0.4 tons per hectare since the early 90s by adopting sustainable land management practices. Number two, innovative ag technologies have helped farmers to make these important adoptions, including herbicide-tolerant crops and their complementary chemicals. But number three, more research and participants are still required in this project. So I encourage farmers across the prairies to complete this survey. And just as a note on that, for any Saskatchewan farmers who still want to complete the survey, it will be open all summer, so you can register and complete the survey whenever works best for you. And for farmers from Alberta and Manitoba, the registration link is open. You can register indicating that you would like to complete the survey, and you'll be contacted later this year letting you know when you can complete it. Thank you all, and thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties that we experienced at the start. Just a note that the link for the crop rotation survey to register is at the bottom of the screen there. Now I will turn it back to Dr. Smyth if he has any comments he'd like to share.
Thank you, Chelsea, and welcome everyone. I apologize, the power went out about 9:45 in Saskatoon, and it took about 20 minutes to come back on, so I apologize. The technical difficulties were beyond my control this time, and in 15 months of work from home, this is the first time I've had any difficulty joining any type of call. So just to provide a bit of context on the results that Chelsea's just presented, one of the objectives of the research chair I hold was to get a better understanding of just how sustainable modern innovations, genetically modified or herbicide tolerant crops and the chemicals that complement that and the changes in equipment have contributed to making agriculture more sustainable in the prairies. And so we undertook an extensive survey. Chelsea's presented on some of the carbon sequestration results today, but we've also gathered data on chemical use, fertilizer use, changes in equipment use, and looking at the profitability of crops throughout the rotation. And those results will be presented over the coming 12 to 18 months.